Everyone thinks they know what happened at Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. Japan launches a surprise attack. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is supposedly shattered, those battleships burning, the Navy paralyzed, America brought to its knees. That story is powerful, it's dramatic. It's also deeply misleading. This episode starts with one of the most common questions in World War II history. Did Pearl Harbor actually cripple the U.S. Navy? Because if you look beyond the explosions and the iconic images, the real answer is far more uncomfortable for Japan, and far more interesting for understanding how modern war really works. The attack on Pearl Harbor was shocking. Yes. It was deadly, yes. But as a strategic blow, it failed in ways that mattered most. The Japanese plan was built around a single assumption, that by destroying American battleships, they could neutralize U.S. power in the Pacific long enough to secure their empire. What they did not understand was that by 1941, battleships were already losing their central role in naval warfare. And even worse for Japan, they misunderstood how the U.S. Navy actually fought wars. On the morning of the attack, 8 American battleships were present in Pearl Harbor, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. The images of these ships burning and capsizing would shape public memory for decades. But here's the critical detail that almost no popular retelling emphasizes. Only 2 of those battleships were permanently lost. Arizona was destroyed in a catastrophic magazine explosion and became a war grave. Oklahoma capsized and, although later raised, never returned to service. The other ships, even those sunk or heavily damaged, were not gone. They were wounded. And the United States had something Japan did not. An industrial system capable of repairing, modernizing, and returning those ships to battle. This episode breaks down why the visual devastation of Pearl Harbor created a myth far larger than the material damage itself. 5 battleships that were sunk or damaged were raised, repaired, and eventually sent back into combat. Stronger, better protected, and far more lethal than before. That alone already challenges the idea of Pearl Harbor as a decisive naval disaster. But the deeper problem for Japan was that battleships were no longer the kings of the sea. By 1941, the real center of naval power had shifted to aircraft carriers. Long-range air power, not heavy armor and big guns, was now deciding battles. And here is the irony that changes everything. Not a single American aircraft carrier was present at Pearl Harbor during the attack. They were at sea, on missions, completely untouched. The very ships that would go on to win the Pacific War survived the greatest surprise attack in naval history without a scratch. This was not luck. It was timing, doctrine, and the slow evolution of warfare colliding in one moment. In this episode, we begin dismantling the myth that Pearl Harbor broke the U.S. Navy. Instead, we show how it exposed the outdated assumptions of both sides and accelerated a transformation that was already underway. The Japanese achieved shock. They achieved fear. They achieved headlines. But they did not destroy the core of American naval power. And they did not stop what mattered most: industrial mobilization, strategic adaptation, and a navy that was already learning to fight a new kind of war. This is not the story of a fleet destroyed. It is the story of a myth born from fire, smoke, and misunderstanding. And in the next part, we will go deeper into the actual balance of naval power in 1941 and why even a perfect Pearl Harbor attack could never have given Japan the victory it hoped for. Here is the part most people never hear. When Pearl Harbor happened, the United States did not suddenly lose its battleship advantage. In fact, even in the worst-case scenario, Japan could not have erased American naval superiority with one strike. In December 1941, the U.S. Navy operated roughly 18 battleships worldwide. 8 were at Pearl Harbor. The rest were split between the Atlantic and training duties. If every single battleship at Pearl Harbor had been permanently destroyed, which they were not, the United States would still have fielded a battleship force comparable to Japan's. And unlike Japan, the U.S. could replace losses at a speed no other nation could match. This is where the myth collapses. The Japanese attack plan assumed that battleships were the decisive metric of naval power. That idea already belonged to the previous war. Japanese planners were fighting World War I with World War II weapons. They measured success by hulls sunk, not by strategic flexibility or industrial depth. The United States, by contrast, was quietly preparing for a long war of production and adaptation. The battleships at Pearl Harbor were not America's newest or fastest ships. Many dated back to World War I or the early 1920s. They were slow, heavily armored, and designed for line-of-battle engagements that no longer reflected how wars at sea were actually fought. By 1941, naval combat was being reshaped by aircraft, submarines, radar, and logistics. And this is where numbers alone stop telling the full story. Japan entered the war with a powerful but fragile fleet. It had excellent ships and highly trained crews, but limited industrial capacity. Once a ship was lost, it was often gone for good. The United States was the opposite. It could lose ships and come back stronger. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not reduce America's ability to build new battleships. It did not damage shipyards. It did not cripple fuel production. It did not hit submarine bases or carrier infrastructure. These targets were far more important than the battleships themselves, and they were largely ignored. This mattered immediately. Within months, the U.S. Navy began commissioning new fast battleships like North Carolina and Washington. These ships could reach nearly 30 knots and operate alongside aircraft carriers. They were not relics. They were designed for modern warfare. At the same time, older battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor were rebuilt with better armor, advanced radar, and massively upgraded anti-aircraft weapons. When they returned to service, they were far more capable than they had been before December 1941. Japan had struck hard, but it had struck the wrong target, and the strategic balance reflects that reality. By mid-1942, despite Pearl Harbor, the United States still possessed a growing battleship force while Japan was already stretching its resources thin. This was not because the Japanese attack failed tactically. It was because it misunderstood what actually mattered in a modern naval war. In the next part, we will look at the role aircraft carriers played before and after Pearl Harbor and why the absence of American carriers on December 7th mattered more than every battleship that burned in the harbor combined. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Pearl Harbor missed the ships that actually mattered. The aircraft carriers. By 1941, carriers were already deciding the future of naval warfare, but many leaders were still emotionally attached to battleships. Japan understood carrier warfare better than most nations at the time, yet on December 7th, their greatest strategic failure was not finding and destroying the American carriers. The U.S. carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were not in port. They were at sea, doing exactly what would soon define the Pacific War: projecting air power over massive distances. This single fact reshaped everything that followed. Battleships looked impressive when burning in shallow water, but carriers were the weapons that could strike back immediately. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, American carriers were already launching raids against Japanese-held islands. The psychological shock Japan delivered was real, but it did not remove America's ability to fight offensively. Carriers did. Battleships could not respond fast enough. They needed air cover. They needed escorts. They needed time. And time was exactly what carriers denied the enemy. Pearl Harbor forced the U.S. Navy to stop debating theory and start adapting instantly. Any lingering belief that battleships alone could dominate the seas died that morning. The U.S. Navy reorganized around carrier task forces, with battleships relegated to escort, shore bombardment, and air defense roles. This was not a downgrade. It was an evolution, and it happened faster because of the attack. Japan ironically proved the carrier's supremacy while failing to eliminate America's carrier force. This created a deadly asymmetry. Japan had fewer carriers and every loss was catastrophic. The United States could build more, and did. By mid-1942, the carrier balance had already begun to tilt. The Battle of Midway would seal it, but Pearl Harbor set the conditions. What makes this even more ironic is that Japanese pilots performed their mission extremely well tactically. They achieved surprise. They inflicted heavy damage. They executed complex coordination under combat stress. But strategy is not about damage alone. It is about outcomes. And the outcome of Pearl Harbor was that the United States entered the war unified, angry, and reorganized around the very weapon Japan relied on most. Carriers were no longer experimental. They were the center of gravity. And because they survived December 7th, the United States retained its ability to strike, adapt, and learn, while Japan slowly bled strength it could not replace. In the next part, we will break down why the industrial gap between the U.S. and Japan made this shift irreversible, and how Pearl Harbor accidentally accelerated America's path to total naval dominance. Here's the part most people ignore. Pearl Harbor did not just fail to cripple the U.S. Navy. It activated something far more dangerous. American industry. Once the shock faded, the real imbalance became obvious. This war was never going to be decided only by tactics or bravery. It was going to be decided by factories, shipyards, steel, and time. Japan entered the war with a highly trained navy and a sharp operational doctrine, but it had one fatal weakness. It could not replace losses at scale. The United States could. And Pearl Harbor removed every political barrier to doing exactly that. Before December 1941, American production was cautious. After December 7th, it became relentless. Shipyards ran day and night. Standardized designs replaced perfection. Speed replaced elegance. The U.S. Navy did not just rebuild what was damaged. It expanded beyond anything Japan could realistically counter. New carriers, new destroyers, new submarines, new aircraft poured into the Pacific. The battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor were being repaired at the same time entirely new classes of warships were being launched. This was not recovery. This was multiplication. And Japan had no answer to it. The Japanese naval doctrine assumed a short war, a decisive early blow, a negotiated settlement. That logic collapsed the moment the United States chose total mobilization. The American economy was larger than Japan's by an order of magnitude. Steel production alone dwarfed Japan's entire industrial base. Every ship Japan lost hurt. Every ship the U.S. lost was replaced and often upgraded. This imbalance meant that even perfect Japanese tactics could only delay defeat, not prevent it. Pearl Harbor bought Japan time, but time favored the Americans. Every month that passed widened the gap. By 1943, the outcome was no longer in question. Only the cost remained. And here's the brutal irony. The battleships at Pearl Harbor that were raised and modernized became symbols of this industrial reality. They returned with better armor, better anti-aircraft guns, better fire control, and radar systems that barely existed in 1941. They fought again not because they were essential, but because America could afford to bring them back. Japan could not. The Pacific War became a war of exhaustion, and the U.S. was uniquely built to win that kind of war. Pearl Harbor did not weaken American resolve. It clarified it. It transformed the conflict from a political debate into an industrial crusade. And once that machine started moving, there was no stopping it. In the next part, we'll look at how this industrial advantage reshaped battleship roles later in the war, and why ships once declared obsolete still mattered in the final campaigns. A lot of people think Pearl Harbor proved that battleships were useless. That's only half true. What it really proved was that battleships could no longer operate alone. After 1941, the role of the battleship didn't vanish. It evolved. Before the war, battleships were designed to fight other battleships. They were floating artillery platforms meant for decisive surface engagements. Pearl Harbor showed that this idea was outdated. Air power had changed everything. But here's the key point. Obsolete does not mean useless. It means situational. And the United States understood this faster than Japan. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy didn't scrap its battleships. It repurposed them. Damaged ships like West Virginia, California, and Tennessee were rebuilt with one clear goal: survive in an air-dominated battlefield. They received massive upgrades: more anti-aircraft guns, new radar systems, improved fire control, better compartmentalization. They were no longer kings of the fleet, of the Yasi. They became heavily armored guardians. Once aircraft carriers became the main striking force, battleships shifted into supporting roles. They protected carriers from air attack. They provided shore bombardment. They absorbed punishment that lighter ships couldn't. This mattered enormously in the Pacific. Capturing islands meant fighting fortified positions: bunkers, caves, coastal guns. These targets required sustained heavy fire, and battleships delivered it for hours, even days. They flattened defenses before troops landed. No carrier could replace that function alone. And here's another advantage. Battleships were incredibly hard to sink. By late war standards, they were floating fortresses. Japan lacked the air power and coordination needed to reliably destroy them, especially once U.S. air superiority became overwhelming. This meant American battleships could operate close to shore with relative safety, supporting invasions from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Meanwhile, Japan failed to adapt its doctrine at the same pace. Its battleships were still seen as decisive weapons rather than support assets. This led to catastrophic decisions. Ships like Yamato were committed to hopeless missions with no air cover, sacrificed for symbolism rather than strategy. The U.S. Navy used battleships pragmatically. Japan used them emotionally. That difference mattered. Pearl Harbor didn't kill the battleship. It stripped it of its illusions. It forced navies to accept a new hierarchy: carriers first, support ships second, and battleships, once symbols of power, became tools of attrition. And in a war defined by attrition, the side with more tools always wins. In the next part, we'll look at the psychological impact of Pearl Harbor and why shock and morale mattered almost as much as ships and steel. When people talk about Pearl Harbor, they usually focus on ships sunk and planes destroyed. But the most powerful weapon Japan used that day wasn't a bomb. It was shock. The attack hit the United States at a psychological level that no previous event had. Even though the material damage was limited, the emotional impact was massive. For Americans in 1941, the idea that the mainland or its territories could be attacked felt unreal. The U.S. had oceans on both sides. Distance had always been a form of protection. Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion overnight. Suddenly, the war wasn't something happening over there. It was personal. That shock created fear, but it also created something far more dangerous for Japan: a united enemy. Before December 7th, American society was deeply divided. Many people opposed entering the war. Isolationism was strong. Pearl Harbor ended that debate instantly. Support for war became overwhelming. Enlistment surged. Industry mobilized. Public opinion hardened. Japan didn't just wake a sleeping giant, it focused it. This is where the psychological effect backfired strategically. The attack gave the U.S. something it desperately needed: a clear moral narrative, a sense of purpose, and political unity. Once that happened, American industrial power was unleashed without restraint. Factories shifted overnight. Car production turned into tank production. Shipyards worked around the clock. The war economy exploded, and unlike Japan, the U.S. had the resources to sustain it for years. On the military side, the shock also forced rapid adaptation. Command structures changed, training improved, doctrine evolved, the Navy learned brutally fast. Early defeats in the Pacific hurt, but they taught lessons that Japan failed to absorb. The U.S. analyzed mistakes, adjusted tactics, and scaled solutions. Japan relied on early success and underestimated recovery. There's another psychological layer that often gets ignored. Pearl Harbor created urgency. Commanders no longer planned for ideal conditions. They planned for worst-case scenarios. This led to redundancy. More carriers, more escorts, more logistics, more air cover. Every failure was treated as unacceptable. This mindset eventually crushed Japan's ability to recover losses. Meanwhile, Japanese leadership misread the impact. They believed fear would lead to negotiation. They assumed the U.S. would seek compromise after a show of force. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. They misunderstood American political culture. Pearl Harbor didn't weaken resolve. It radicalized it. The war became non-negotiable. Total victory became the only acceptable outcome. In the long run, this mattered more than any sunk battleship. Japan gained months of operational freedom, but the United States gained years of unstoppable momentum. And in a total war, momentum is everything. In the next part, we'll look at how Pearl Harbor reshaped the timeline of the Pacific War and why Japan's early advantage was always temporary. Here's the uncomfortable truth that rarely gets said. Japan never had a real path to victory after Pearl Harbor. Not because its pilots weren't skilled, and not because its navy wasn't powerful, but because time itself was the enemy. From day one, Japan was fighting against math, industry, and logistics. The early months of the Pacific War looked impressive. Fast advances, fallen colonies, stunning naval victories. But beneath the surface, the structure was already collapsing. Japan's strategy depended on one massive assumption: that the United States would lose the will to fight. That assumption was wrong, and everything built on it failed. Once the U.S. committed fully, the balance of power shifted relentlessly. Every carrier Japan lost was a strategic wound. Every carrier the U.S. lost was a temporary setback. The difference was replacement speed. American shipyards produced new carriers, faster battleships, escorts, and aircraft at a pace Japan could not even approach. By 1943, the gap was no longer theoretical. It was visible everywhere, in the air, at sea, and in logistics. Japan struggled to protect supply lines. Fuel shortages worsened. Trained pilots became irreplaceable losses. The U.S., by contrast, standardized training, mass-produced aircraft, and rotated crews efficiently. This created depth. Japan had elite units. The U.S. had layers, and in long wars, layers beat elites every time. The turning point wasn't a single battle, it was accumulation. Midway mattered because it removed Japan's offensive flexibility. Guadalcanal mattered because it drained resources. Saipan mattered because it brought American bombers within range of Japan itself. But none of these alone decided the war. They were steps in a process. The process was industrial strangulation. Pearl Harbor accelerated that process by forcing the U.S. to prioritize the Pacific fully. It also exposed Japan's strategic ceiling. Even at peak expansion, Japan lacked the shipping fuel and manpower to hold what it conquered. The empire expanded faster than it could be supplied. Once the U.S. adopted island hopping, this weakness became fatal. Japanese forces were bypassed, isolated, and starved out. No decisive battle required, just pressure and time. This is the part that popular narratives miss. The Pacific War wasn't won by one brilliant move. It was won by endurance, by logistics, by learning faster than the enemy, and by having an economy that could absorb mistakes. Japan fought with precision and courage. but it fought a war it could not sustain. The outcome was written long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. In the final part, we'll pull everything together and explain why Pearl Harbor matters not as a victory or a defeat, but as the moment the direction of the war became irreversible.